Today we're back with another, more editing-intensive compilation. This time we've mixed down a full hour of the best Pokemon-related cut content and unused ideas from the main DidYouKnowGaming channel. If you like this more heavily edited approach, do us a favor and give this video a like, and subscribe if you want more. But enough of the preamble, let's get to the trivia.
Did you know? Instead of badges, Pokemon trainers almost traveled around collecting belts. The first gym leader would have given you a white belt, and the last gym leader a black belt. Game Freak even considered letting you whip your Pokemon with them, like some sort of lion tamer. For this video, we went to great lengths to ensure that these facts would actually be something that roughly 99% of you had never heard of. And one thing we did was have 100 pages of a Japan-only book translated, which was written by Game Freak developer Akihito Tomisawa. Tomisawa writes, "The development staff decided humans should have ranks as monster trainers. The initial idea was that as the player's Pokemon reached a certain level of strength, they would earn belts like a martial artist." He recalls them saying, "Not just white belts and black belts like in judo, there should be more colors. Well, if you could receive a belt, what if you could use it as a training whip? Like a red whip or a black whip or a yellow whip." Ultimately, it was too cruel to make the player whip their Pokemon, so the idea got scrapped. Their relationship with the player should be friendlier, like a pet owner, so eventually it was decided you'd earn badges instead. But even though the belt idea got thrown out, actual whips were still very much on the menu. This beta sprite shows Trainer Red carried a whip at some point in Red and Green's development, and even though Red's eventually got taken away, lots of other trainers' whips still made it into Generation 1's final build. And now we're going to jump back into cut content from Generation 2. That entire Japan-based region was scrapped, but later in development there were also parts of Johto that got cut, but can still be found in the game's internal data. Most of them are just early designs for Johto's cities. Possibly the most interesting is the Lake of Rage, which originally had an entire town built around it. There's also a tiny Safari Zone, once meant for Fuchsia City. But the map we really want to highlight is this forest, which the data refers to as Fuji. This Fuji forest was originally located at the foot of Mount Silver, which is based on the real-life Mount Fuji in Japan. In fact, in early builds of Gold and Silver, Mount Silver was literally called Mount Fuji. In the real world, there's a forest at the foot of Mount Fuji called the Sea of Trees, also known as the Suicide Forest. It's got a historical reputation as a home to ghosts, and it's one of the most used suicide sites globally at over 100 deaths per year. The government even puts up signs in the forest that encourage suicidal visitors to think of their families and reach out to a suicide prevention association. By the way, all this information was sent to us by Pierre Carrot, a Generation 2 disassembler and one of the members of Team Spaceworld, so full credit goes to him. In Generation 2's final build, there's only one new ghost type, Misdreavus, who can only be found at Mount Silver. It's likely the forest was planned as a home not just for Misdreavus, but other ghost Pokemon as well, but in an effort to avoid the risk of controversy, Game Freak ended up cutting the location and replacing it with this map, which bears no resemblance to the Suicide Forest. Despite its removal though, the forest can still be found, hidden in the game's internal data. Red, the main playable character from the first generation of Pokemon games, was originally known as Satoshi in Japan. However, this wasn't the character's first name. Thanks to the Pokemon fan site helixchamber.com, information from prototypes of the original Pokemon games have been published. This includes graphics and a name for the game's playable character, Yuichi. Multiple sprites for Yuichi have been found, including his intro animation from full to overworld sprite. Data also reveals a previously unseen early back sprite for Red. Red may have been planned to have a bigger role in the second-gen games. This evidence comes from an early prototype build of Pokemon Gold and Silver, known as the Spaceworld 1997 demo. This prototype of Gold and Silver was showcased back at Nintendo's 1997 Spaceworld trade show, a full 2 years before the game's initial release. Although the demo is thought to be lost for over 2 decades, on May 26, 2018, an anonymous user uploaded it to the Pokemon Reverse Engineering Tool's Discord channel. Thanks to the efforts of a dedicated fan group known as Team Spaceworld, the demo's long-hidden secrets have been revealed. Among them is the discovery that players can't name their character in the demo, and instead, the trainer is always named Satoshi, Red's canon name at the time. While this could suggest that the main character of Pokémon Gold and Silver was originally intended to be the same trainer from the first-generation games, Team Spaceworld has found evidence to the contrary. It turns out that the Spaceworld 1997 demo was a carefully curated slice of the game that included many aspects that were touched up or completely altered specifically for the show. However, by editing a single byte of the game's ROM, it's possible to see the actual build of Pokémon Gold and Silver Game Freak had at that time. DidYouKnowGaming reached out to Samuel Obscure Mesner, one of Team Spaceworld's leading hackers and translators, for an explanation. Mesner stated, "The fact that the player can't name their character was thrown together specifically for the Spaceworld demo. If you disable demo mode, you get to name your trainer as usual. The default names you can choose from for the player are Gold, Satoshi, and Jack. And for the rival, they are Silver, Shigeru, and John." My educated guess for why they chose Satoshi and Shigeru for the demo is that they wanted to ride the hype of the anime, which had been airing for a few months at the time. On top of that, there's definite evidence that the player character in the early Gen 2 wasn't meant to be the same trainer as in Gen 1. This evidence can be found when the ROM is edited. When players walk into the tall grass at the start of the game, they are stopped by their rival, Blue, and taken back to the lab. After the player receives their starter Pokémon, Blue hands them a Pokédex, saying, "I used to want to be the world's best Pokémon trainer. When I got too arrogant, there was one who showed me humility. Somehow, you remind me of him. Thanks to him, I was able to mend my ways." If that isn't enough, a debug mode can be accessed in the Spaceworld 1997 demo by pressing Select on the title screen. This debug mode includes a number of unique differences that set it apart from the other versions of the demo. The player's default name is set as Koji, whereas their rival's name is Red. This may be in reference to Koji Nishino, a designer at Game Freak, who was also the inspiration for the Pokémon Snorlax. Mesner told us this could mean that, at an even earlier stage in Pokémon Gold and Silver's development, Red was slated to be the rival. However, it's more likely that the programmers just chose some arbitrary names. Secrets have also been found in the debug modes of other Pokémon games too, even those that reach store shelves. For example, the debug mode of the English versions of Pokémon Red, Blue, and Yellow changes the player's default name to Ninten and the rival's name to Sony, a reference to Nintendo's bitter rivalry with Sony's PlayStation at the time. When debug mode is enabled in Pokémon Red and Green versions, the player is named Yamaguchi. This pays homage to Wataru Yamaguchi, who received a special thank you in the game's credits. Meanwhile, the player's rival is named Ishihara, referencing Tsunekazu Ishihara, who is now the president of the Pokémon Company. In the Japanese Blue, the player is named Gefuri, an abbreviated play on Game Freak, and the rival is called Kuricha, a nod to the game's co-developers Creatures Inc. Many files relating to the Underground from Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum can be found in the data for Heart Gold and Soul Silver, suggesting this feature was meant to make a comeback at one point. This icon resembles Crystal, the female playable character from Pokémon Crystal, perhaps suggesting her design was planned to appear in the remakes instead of Lyra. There are two notable unused items also hidden in the game's files. The first is a photo album that would have held any photos the player took during the game. In the final release, photos are simply stored in the player's PC, making the album redundant. The second unused item is known as the Lock Capsule, which according to its in-game description, can only be opened with a special key. When hacked into the game, the item does nothing. Its original purpose was to be transferred to Pokémon Black and White, where the player could take it to Mr. Lock in Castelia City in order to receive a TM for the move Snarl. If the player obtains the legendary Pokémon Arceus through a special giveaway in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, they can access the Sinnoh Ruins area, where they receive their choice of a level 1 Palkia, Dialga, or Giratina. It's actually possible to visit the Sinnoh Ruins a second time, but only if the player has a second Arceus obtained from an in-game event in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl that went unused, meaning that this second trip is normally impossible. Should the player hack the game to make the event happen, the hiker who greets them will have new dialogue welcoming them back, and the player will be able to obtain one of the two Pokémon that they didn't choose the first time round.
We'll get back to the Pokémon facts in a second, but first, a word from this video's sponsor, Mint Mobile. If you'd rather spend your brainpower absorbing Pokémon trivia than deciphering a wireless bill, Mint is worth a look. Mint Mobile offers premium wireless without the premium price, and they sell online, which means no store trip, no awkward sales pitch, no paying for way more data than you actually use. You can choose from 5, 15, and 20 gigabytes or an unlimited data plan. You can even keep your number and your unlocked phone activated with an eSIM right from home. They also offer unlimited talk and text on the nation's largest 5G network, with coverage reaching 98% of Americans. We like that we could get set up from the couch in basically no time. Stop overpaying for wireless just because that's how it's always been. With premium plans starting at $15 a month, Mint helps you break the traditional wireless cycle. Scan the QR code on screen or go to mintmobile.yt.link/DXBGCEF. Or go to the link in the description. And now, back to the trivia.
Did you know? Brock wasn't always the first gym leader in the original Pokémon games. Illustrations by art director Ken Sugimori suggest a young child was initially the first gym leader. It's speculated that Giovanni replaced the child, and the first gym battle would have taken place in Viridian City instead of the 8th gym battle. The 7th gym leader, Blaine, originally had a different design. He initially wore a military uniform, which was eventually swapped out for lab attire. This was likely done to distance Blaine from Lieutenant Surge and to give Blaine stronger ties to Cinnabar Island. His appearance wasn't changed immediately, however, as early full-color art still uses this design. This design was also the foundation for Blaine's appearance in the Pokémon anime. In the original design documents for Pokémon, there was a charisma stat which impacted the player's chances of catching a wild Pokémon. This charm mechanic was likely replaced by the current process of weakening a Pokémon before catching it. The series has other interesting features that were cut. During development of X and Y, there were plans to include a translation machine. This would convert a Pokémon's cries into dialogue, allowing the player to understand what Pokémon were saying. This idea had to be scrapped, as writing dialogue for the 600-plus Pokémon was impractical. In the international versions of Red and Blue, there's unused trade data where the player would trade a Butterfree in exchange for a Beedrill. This data also appears in Pokemon Yellow, but Yellow also has data for 2 other trades, as the ones in Cerulean and Vermilion City had been removed. They were replaced with trades of a Pidgeot for a Pidgeot and a Mew for a Mew. Both Pokemon were nicknamed Matsumiya, likely in reference to scenario writer Toshinobu Matsumiya, of which Yellow was his first credited game. These names were even translated into English. The 2 Pokemon were renamed Marty and Bart, respectively, perhaps as a reference to both Marty McFly and Bart Simpson. All of these trades are functional and can be accessed through hacking. Trainer rematches were a feature introduced in Pokemon Gold and Silver. However, in an interview with Pokemon CEO Tsunekazu Ishihara, he revealed that during Red and Green's testing and debugging process, the game would trigger a trainer battle every time you walk past them. This would happen even if the player already fought the trainer before, thus allowing rematches. This also made areas like Viridian Forest take upwards to an hour to get through. The encounter rate for wild Pokemon was again much higher, with the player being unable to take 2 steps without bumping into a Pokemon. Ishihara said it would have taken players literally half a day to get through a cave, so the team changed things accordingly for the final game. More early and unused elements of Red and Green were unveiled in a manga chronicling Pokemon creator Satoshi Tajiri, released in May of 2018. This included ideas previously unknown to the general public, from unused Pokemon to early sprite work. Among the sprites, an early version of Nidoking is shown with a full-body back sprite, as opposed to the top half shown in the final game. Full-body back sprites wouldn't be given to all Pokemon until Pokemon Black and White, over 14 years later. In the first draft of Mewtwo Strikes Back, Mew could talk, and it was actually kind of a jerk. In one of his Japanese blog posts we translated, the movie's head writer Takeshi Shudo said, "There were lots of points where Mew told Mewtwo, 'After all, you're nothing but a copy.'" This triggered Mewtwo's inferiority complex and a burning hatred towards the original Pokemon. These lines were meant to needle at Mewtwo and defend its ego. It was like a drama where they debated Mewtwo's right to exist. Mew's personality is violent and unpredictable, and yet it looks innocent, cute somehow, and doesn't appear to be threatening. So in a way, it's both cruel and effective for Mew to incessantly chip away at Mewtwo's self-esteem. Shudo goes on to say they had a hard time making Mew's voice sound both innocent and offensive, so they just changed it so Mew just flies around looking cute saying its own name. Speaking of early designs, the November 1996 issue of CoroCoro magazine was the first time Pokemon Blue was ever announced, and the magazine showed off some beta sprites that were planned to appear in blue, but ended up getting replaced at the last minute, including one for Mewtwo. We actually think it's a pretty big improvement over the Mewtwo sprite that did end up getting used, not only in Japanese Blue, but the versions of Red and Blue that released internationally. This unused blue sprite for Mew was discovered in a 2019 leak of prototype assets, but a couple even more interesting sprites were discovered in leaks dating back to Gen 2's development, revealing a couple early designs for Celebi. The first is pretty clearly modeled after the Native American fertility god Kokopelli, who's known for being a bit of a trickster. With origins dating back over 1,000 years, Kokopelli presided over childbirth and agriculture, and also represented the spirit of music, and playing his flute was said to chase away winter and usher in spring. While a little less obvious, the later Celebi appears Kokopelli-inspired as well, and displays a strong Native American motif. Game Freak never commented on these leaked sprites, but fans have speculated the designs were scrapped possibly to avoid controversy. Kokopelli was primarily a god of the Hopi tribe, who still exists today but were mostly wiped out during colonization. Ruby and Sapphire weren't originally planned to include any Pokémon from past generations. Game Freak eventually used this strategy to make Gen 5 feel like a soft reboot, but the idea initially started with Gen 3. Sugimori said, "The goal was to make something that felt new. A lot of people said that not much had really changed in Gen 2, and we kept wondering why that was. And I think it's because there were too many familiar Pokémon appearing in Gold and Silver. The first Pokémon you encountered was a Pidgey, and while nostalgia's fine and all, I wanted to draw lots of new Pokémon." The game's director Junichi Masuda was also present in that interview and said, "From the early stages of development until past the halfway point, we planned on Ruby and Sapphire featuring nothing but brand new Pokémon. Since Ruby and Sapphire weren't compatible with the earlier Game Boy games, there would have been no way to trade Kanto and Johto Pokémon up to Gen 3. Well, at least not until Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Pokémon Colosseum released a year later. This would have made Gen 3 a pretty hard reboot, even more so than Gen 5, where old Pokémon could still be found in the post-game. But Game Freak ultimately decided to scrap the Hoenn reboot idea due to balancing issues. Basically, there just weren't enough Pokémon of certain elemental types, so they peppered in older Pokémon to quote, fill the gaps. But because the change was made fairly late in development, the game's origins as a reboot still ended up leaving some pretty significant impacts on Ruby and Sapphire's final builds. For one thing, it explains why there's so many new Pokémon in Gen 3, and also why older Pokémon make up such a small percentage of the Hoenn decks. And according to Sugimori and Masuda, it's also why you see nothing but brand new Pokémon until after you've made it past the third town, because originally, it was all supposed to be a Pokémon reboot. The scrapped reboot idea is also the reason some of the new Pokémon exist in the first place. As Sugimori explains it, when we decided to have only new Pokémon in these games, it became necessary to make Pokémon that fill the same role as Pidgey, and make a weak caterpillar Pokémon like Caterpie. For some people, Ruby and Sapphire will be their first Pokémon game, and showing them a caterpillar turning into a cocoon, then a butterfly, is the easiest way to introduce the concept of evolution. So we intentionally made Wurmple to be like Caterpie, but a little different. In other words, Pokémon like Wurmple and Tailo would have never existed if Gen 3 hadn't spent a chunk of its development as a reboot. There's been quite a few leaks of Pokémon beta sprites in recent years, including a text-only Pokédex that described an early version of Rayquaza as the White Dragon Pokémon. But so far, there hasn't been a leak of the actual beta sprites. It seems there's at least 2 sets of beta sprites, the batch sent to Nintendo for testing, and a later batch used in a Japanese demo. About 4 months before Ruby and Sapphire released in Japan, Nintendo toured an event called Pokémon Festa around a few Japanese cities. Several screenshots were published showing slightly different designs for Pokémon like Sharpedo. But to this day, what else could be hiding inside those Festa demos remains a mystery. Maybe someday these 2 beta sprite sets will leak and we'll finally get a chance to see White Rayquaza, the Grass-type Sprinklermon, and countless more scrapped monster designs. Originally, Pokémon Gold and Silver were very different games that essentially followed the vision of Satoshi Tajiri, the series creator and director of Gen 1. To understand how drastic the change was, programmer Tetsuya Watanabe says, "That version's a completely different game from what made it to store shelves. Everything got remade after that. The first world map was very grand in scale, and based on the entirety of Japan. However, this meant we couldn't spare much cartridge space for each individual town, nor put much distance between them, so it all felt much more compact than the Kanto games. Development was a bit of a struggle, and things weren't going too well. They didn't want to disappoint their millions and millions of fans, so Tajiri stepped aside and let Junichi Masuda take his place and recreate Gold and Silver according to his own vision." The original Tajiri build of Gold and Silver is best known for appearing in the leaked Spaceworld 1997 demos. It had a unique Johto dex that ended up getting almost entirely scrapped, and all of Japan squeezed inside. In another Japanese magazine, Masuda explains his complete transformation of Gen 2, saying, "I took over direction of Gold and Silver from Tajiri, then went to Kyoto to create my vision for the Johto region." That does make sense because Johto is based on Masuda's walks through Kyoto, home to many of Japan's most famous castles. In the Tajiri version, places had names like Mount Fuji, Silent Hill, and Old City. Some were probably placeholders, but regardless, in Masuda's version they went back to naming places after colors, like what they did in Gen 1, Goldenrod, Ekritique City, and Mahogany Town for example. In one of these magazines they say they intentionally chose unusual and old-fashioned words for colors, so when fans got older, eventually they'd come across those colors as adults and think, huh, that's the name of that Pokémon town. Gold and Silver were originally supposed to launch in 1997, but the complete transformation after Masuda took over meant it got delayed all the way to 99. There was also the matter of debugging, which took 6 months all on its own. When they started debugging, they didn't even know what Pokémon were going to make it into the final game. According to Watanabe in one of those magazines, about 200 ended up in the trash. We already covered all the Spaceworld 97 demo Pokémon in older videos, so today we're going to highlight a few who got cut even later in development. The 2020 leak didn't include these Pokémon names, but according to Game Freak, a lot of them never had names to begin with. So let's start with this scrapped Tanuki Pokémon. This Pokémon's a reference to one Tanuki in particular, the villain of a Japanese folktale called Kachi Kachiyama. It's pretty weird, but to sum it up, a farmer finds a Tanuki in his fields, so he traps it to cook for dinner later. When the farmer leaves for town, the Tanuki begs the farmer's wife to set him free. She takes pity, but once it's free, it kills her, chops her up, and later tricks her husband into eating her flesh in a soup. Anyway, the farmer's got a rabbit friend who swears vengeance, and later when the Tanuki's carrying some firewood on his back, the rabbit sets it ablaze. That's usually the cover on storybook versions of the folktale, and that's what this Pokémon was, the deranged, tortured Tanuki from Kachi Kachiyama. There was also this cute ghost flanked by a couple Hitodama. In Japanese culture, Hitodama are balls of fire that are dead people's souls separated from their bodies. That's why the ghosts' purple fires have little faces. Hitodama literally translates into English as souls of the dead. Conversely, this stork Pokémon with a baby in its beak was based on Western folklore. This next one was a middle stage between Natu and Xatu. The sprite leak was black and white, but Natu and Xatu were brown in Tajiri's Gen 2, so their middle evolution was probably brown as well. After Masuda took over, the birds were changed to green, so if it hadn't got cut, the mid-stage presumably would have ended up green too. We'll do a few more rapid fire, like this flying squirrel with a sheathed sword and a ninja motif, but the flying squirrel that ultimately made it into Gen 2 was Sentret instead. There was also this foxtail Pokémon who may have wound up getting turned into Furret. This little dinosaur got cut, but a similar design made it into Gen 4 as Cranidos. Likewise, this Cyclops Scorpion looks a lot like Gen 4's Skorupi, and this koala Pokémon appears it was sorta recycled to make Kamala from Gen 7. There was also a boar with antlers, a long-tongued frog, this rabbity Pikachu-y thing, and maybe the strangest of them all, this monstrous skeleton Pokémon. But since we're already in rapid fire mode, first we want to toss out some random trivia we found in these magazines, like that Gold and Silver were simplified for art director Ken Sugimori's dad. Sugimori let his pops play some Gen 1, but he couldn't even figure out how to leave the first house. So Sugimori had them simplify Gen 2 for folks like his old man, like making the UI dummy-proof and having the select button bring out your bike. See haters, Pokémon's not a kid's game. It's for really old people too. He also wanted to simplify all the Pokémon sprites from 4 colors down to 2, but the other devs called it an impossible request. Here's what Pikachu and Lugia might have looked like in that style, compared to how they ended up looking in the release version. Seemingly, Sugimori wanted them that way not to save space, but for minimalistic design sensibilities. They don't look great, but maybe they would have looked better on a tiny Game Boy with no backlight, in Sugimori's opinion. The devs also say adding Kanto was an impulsive decision early in development. Someone just said it'd be cool, so they went and did it. It was already in that early Tajiri version, but all squeezed into the size of a single city.
Did you know? Game Freak originally intended for every copy of Gen 1 to be personalized, but Shigeru Miyamoto told them to make different color versions instead. In Gen 1's release version, when you boot up a new game, it randomly assigns you a trainer ID number between 1 and 65,535. This ID system is actually a leftover from a time when there were 65,535 different versions planned. Looking back on Pokemon's development, Tajiri said, "The shape of a forest, the Pokemon that appear. I wanted to make a game that would be different for everyone, but it was difficult. So I went to consult with Shigeru Miyamoto from Nintendo, and we ended up deciding to make it so depending on the color, whether red or green, the worlds would be parallel, but different. Not only were the Pokemon in each cartridge all different, but even Kanto itself was, with locations changing based on your trainer ID number. Eventually, we translated the biggest Satoshi Tajiri interview ever published. The interview itself is 34 pages long, and we'll publish it in its entirety in the future. But for now, we just want to highlight the part where Tajiri says every cartridge was like a different world. He said, "So we randomly assigned auto-generated ID numbers from 1 to 65,000 to every game cartridge. With the cartridge IDs randomly determined, Pokemon caught in those games would all carry that ID number. So long as someone wasn't trading with 65,000 different people, the odds of trading with someone with the same ID were unlikely. With both parties having different numbers, their Pokemon would be entering different worlds when traded. Then, once the number is assigned, it would never change throughout the course of the game." I talked to Miyamoto about how we'd make players understand that every cartridge is different when they buy one, and he told me the system sounded interesting, but it was a bit difficult to grasp. He said if players can't tell just by looking at it, then it won't work out, and it would be better if the game's color or appearance were different. I was shocked when I was allowed to do that. I told him it would really help me out if I could. So it was from trying to differentiate ID numbers that the idea to symbolically change the colors came about. I thought we should do it, but alter the colors for real. We needed to do more to make the different color games have all kinds of details in them that were a bit different. Here, Tajiri says 65,000, but the exact number was 65,535, which is the highest number that can be represented by an unsigned 16-bit binary number. Or, to put it in simpler terms, 65,535 is the biggest number you can use on a Game Boy without slowing down the entire game and overcomplicating the programming. Game Freak probably would have had to use randomly generated landscapes, similar to what they did a few years later in the Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games. Pokémon did break new ground in many ways, like being the first game to allow trading through the Game Boy Link cable, but producing 65,000 Kantos would have been significantly more complicated. Tajiri went on to say that after Miyamoto convinced him to give up on the idea for 65,000 different versions of Gen 1, he still wanted to make between 5 and 7 different color versions, but he realized even 7 iterations of the same game would be tricky, not only in terms of development, but even outside forces like the factory not wanting to produce multiple cartridges and packaging for what they viewed as an identical product. So eventually he had no choice but to settle for less. In Satoshi Tajiri's biographical manga, Miyamoto tells us what happened next. He says, "I came up with the slogan, 'The game begins when you choose a cartridge,' and we made models for 3 colors, red, green, and blue. Then later in development, we narrowed it down to just 2 versions, and it looked like we were going to use red and blue, but we ultimately decided that Venusaur's design was so good that we released red and green instead. And so, over the course of a few months, 65,000 variations were whittled down to just 2, featuring different version-exclusive Pokémon, different encounter rates, and various other small changes, like which Pokémon you can buy at the game corner. But these are far from the only secrets we've discovered on our journey, like that Gen 1 almost didn't have multiplayer Pokémon battles, and that the only player-to-player interactions would have been buying, selling, and trading Pokémon to and with each other. In fact, multiplayer battles only barely made it in at the last minute because Nintendo demanded it, and since the Big N was funding development, Game Freak had no choice but to comply. But they did it in the laziest way possible, a system where you just watched Pokémon fight on their own, with zero input from the player. Gen 1 programmer Shigeki Morimoto explains it best, saying, "President Tajiri had wanted us to implement battling for a while, but I personally didn't didn't find the idea very interesting, and just thought it would be a pain to program. It looked like we would run out of time and would have to scrap the battling feature, but Nintendo made it clear they wanted battles in the game, so we had to make it happen. So I just thought, well, no choice then, it has to be done. And the early battles were something you just watched. You would just see there was a battle and who won and who lost. We showed that to Nintendo, and the surveys we got back called it boring. I guess they were right, but we were cutting it close to the deadline, trying to add in battles that the player commands. Ultimately, it's what everyone wanted, so we got it to work with the link cable and made it a reality. Satoshi Tajiri was also in that interview and helped explain how in-game currency would have helped make up for the lack of PvP battles. Every Pokémon would have had a specified monetary value, and you'd purchase them at in-game stores or buy and sell with your friends. According to Tajiri, the only reason the focus on cash ended up being cut was due to hardware limitations. He said, in Pokémon's early development, you could buy Pokémon with money, but that resulted in the player focusing on saving money to buy them, and less motivation to struggle catching them in the wild. We also thought about making one player pay money in addition to their trade when there was an obvious difference in the value of two Pokémon being traded, but implementing Pokémon monetary values was beyond the limits of our programming. Transferring money in the game is very different from wiring money in real life, and there were difficulties getting it to work on the Game Boy. There were just too many obstacles to overcome to make it happen. We had no choice but to focus on what we wanted most and give up on the rest. In this case, being able to trade Pokémon was our top priority, so we cut the monetary value feature. Adding a little more info, Game Freak developer Akihito Tamisawa says, in the initial plan, every town had a shop that sold Pokémon, so you could buy tons of them if you had enough money. But what was once thought of as an outstanding idea to have Pokémon stores ultimately got cut. Even HP bars almost got cut in development. Game Freak only made action games prior to working on Pokémon, so much of Red and Green's development was spent fumbling around in the dark. They wanted to make Pokémon as simple to understand as possible. So, they removed the use of numbers wherever they could, even in Pokémon battles. In a 2019 issue of Famitsu Weekly, Junichi Masuda said, "Of course we thought Tajiri's idea was fun and exciting, but we had a problem. We didn't have any experience making RPGs. In the final game, HP is displayed with a meter, but at one point in development it was represented with text. We came up with 16 different statuses, descriptions like, they're still okay, or it's gonna get pretty bad soon. But it wasn't very interesting, so we scrapped it." Masuda explained that incoming damage worked the same way with phrases like, that hurt, and that really hurt, to give players some idea of how much damage they'd taken. But ultimately they realized that the entire system just kinda sucked, so they replaced it with the standard HP system used in most other RPGs. Another scrapped idea we want to talk about is how Gen 1 was originally played for keeps, where if you lost a battle, you lost your Pokémon. Ken Sugimori said when Satoshi Tajiri first came to him and was trying to explain the Pokémon concept, he said it would be like the Menko cards they played with when they were kids. In case you're not familiar, Menko come in lots of different shapes and sizes. Kids collect these cards and can use them to play a game sort of like battling. Then in the end, the winner gets to keep some of the loser's cards. In Famimaga 64 magazine, Tajiri said he originally planned for Pokémon battles to play out in a similar fashion. The interviewer asked, "Don't you think it would be interesting if when you lost a Pokémon battle, your opponent took your Pokémon, like with Menko cards?" And Tajiri replied, "Actually, I made something like that as a prototype, but in the end, the frustration of having Pokémon you raised taken away from you was too great, so I scrapped that idea." Did you know Zekrom and Reshiram weren't originally black and white in color? According to Gen 5's art director Ken Sugimori, they were initially more colorful, as Sugimori thought monochromatic designs were boring and wouldn't look good on the game's box art. But later in development, he was persuaded to remove most of their colors to better express Gen 5's theme of polarity, or extreme opposites. The alternate artwork included in the game's manual actually depicts Zekrom and Reshiram from earlier on in the design process, which ended up getting repurposed as what they look like when they're powered up. But Sugimori implied they were originally even more colorful than that, so it's possible the dragon's unused colors made their way into black and white Kyurems designs a few years later. On the other hand, Unova's Elite Four originally were all black and white, with Chantal and Grimsley in all black, and Marshall and Caitlin all white. But before the games released, color was added to the Elite Four, while color was removed from the legendary dragons. Masuda later admitted to then Nintendo president Satoru Iwata he had a personal interest in choosing New York because in addition to being the series director, he was also the music composer. In the past, the Pokémon Company hosted a series of concerts in all the Japanese regions their games were set in, including the real-life region of Kanto. Masuda dreamed of seeing his music performed in the world-famous theaters of New York on their next concert tour, and this desire was part of his motivation to make New York the setting for the 5th generation. Masuda's favorite classical composer was Igor Stravinsky, a 19th century conductor that influenced Masuda while making music for Pokémon games. Stravinsky played at New York theaters like Carnegie Hall and ultimately spent his final years in New York and died on 5th Avenue, so it must have meant something quite profound for Masuda to follow in Stravinsky's footsteps. But after Black and White were already finished, Masuda found out it would be too complicated and expensive to fly their Japanese orchestra to the United States. So the New York concerts he'd been dreaming about never became a reality. If he had known that from the start, Gen 5 may have taken place somewhere else and have turned out completely different. Gen 5 was also the first generation to have a female professor. This was thanks to Sugimori, who says Professor Juniper was originally a man until halfway into development when he insisted the character should be changed into a woman. He said, "I went and complained to Masuda. I told him, make the professor a woman. I was the one who'd proposed the changes, so I decided to design her myself. I thought she'd be kind of a New Yorker type. In other words, a real career woman." The Litwick family was inspired by will-o'-the-wisps and Hitodama, souls of the dead that separate from their bodies and become balls of fire. According to Ken Sugimori, early in development, the Litwick family was originally a flame that evolved into a candle, then into a lamp. But its initial flame stage ended up being scrapped, and Game Freak added a chandelier to the ghost family instead. Sugimori says Volcarona originally had 4 wings, but ended up receiving 2 more later on in development. This is probably because Volcarona is based on Mothra from the Godzilla movies. In fact, Volcarona's German name is Ramoth, an anagram of the name Mothra. Earlier in development, Hydreigon had 8 heads and was based on Yamata no Orochi, a legendary 8-headed dragon from Japanese mythology. But the design was too complicated, so the head count was reduced to 3. But it retained 6 wings, so its silhouette had the appearance of a 9-headed dragon. According to Sugimori, this makes Hydreigon 1 head better than Yamata no Orochi. Its final design ended up looking a lot like King Ghidorah, also known as the 3-headed monster, one of Toho's most famous kaiju. But Sugimori says even before the Orochi motif, the Hydreigon family were originally designed as a family of tank dragons, and the purple treads on their bellies are leftovers from when they were still based on tanks. This might explain why Hydreigon's family's shinies are green, since Pokemon's beta colors are sometimes repurposed as their shiny colors. This may have happened to Dwebble as well, who's got a red shiny and was probably fire type earlier on in development. Sugimori says Dwebble and Crustle were originally furnace Pokemon with shells made out of kiln-fired pottery, but their designs were revised. In a series of Japanese magazines DidYouKnowGaming had translated for this video, Ken Sugimori revealed many secrets about Gen 5's Pokemon, like that Stunfisk was originally a blue goosefish and was created as the world's flattest Pokemon. But later in development, Stunfisk was revised into a brown flounder, and had its water and electric typing changed to ground and electric. Sugimori's team also came up with an ant Pokemon who would have been the world's smallest Pokemon, but it didn't make the final cut. The Petalil family originally had 3 stages, but 1 stage got cut due to Unova having too many grass-type Pokemon. Early in development, there was also a family of snail Pokemon who were meant to serve as prey and get eaten by the Carablast family, but they were replaced with the Shelmet family, who initially didn't have a connection with Carablast. At the end of Pokemon Gold and Silver, there's a battle against the strongest trainer in the game, Red, from Gen 1. Fighting your previous self in Mount Silver was Gen 2's biggest battle, serving as the grand finale of the game. A similar idea was planned for Black and White 2, where the player would have an epic battle against Hilbert and Hilda, the protagonists from Black and White 1. The internal data includes text for the PWT building like, "Meet Hilbert, the trainer some claim to be the strongest of all," and dialogue where Hilda tells you, "Make your dreams come true. Someone once encouraged me to do that. Even now, I'm continuing my journey to realize those dreams," which is a reference to the final scene in Black and White, when N tells the player to make their dreams come true. This is Nob Ogasawara, descended from Japanese Emperor Seiwa. The Ogasawaras are a samurai clan who once ruled over the Shinano province, as well as parts of Kyushu, the real-life basis for the Hoenn region. But after Japan's defeat in World War II, a series of reforms stripped the Ogasawaras of their land and gave it to commoners. In 1968, Nob's family moved to Canada to start a new life. Nob would grow up to become a translator, and one day be hired by Nintendo of America to translate a new Game Boy game called Pocket Monsters Red and Blue. Over the next decade, he localized 26 Pokémon games into English almost single-handedly. He translated all of the game's small text, but the big text, like city and Pokémon names, were mostly handled by his boss, Hiro Nakamura. But Nob did name some Pokémon, and also came up with some names in development that were never used. Nob officially left the franchise after Pokémon Platinum, but today we've asked him to make a return in an unofficial capacity, because there were some Pokémon that Game Freak created and gave Japanese names to, but scrapped in development before they ever went through the localization process. So in this video, we'll be discussing these lost Pokémon, their development history, lore, and entertaining a what-if scenario where they were never cut, and Nob got the chance to name them. He just had one stipulation for us, that he'd only name lost Pokémon who had official Japanese names, because that's how the process worked back when he was Pokémon's official English localizer. And now that we have all that out of the way, let's begin. According to Pokémon's creators, Satoshi Tajiri and Ken Sugimori, the first 20 or 30 designs they came up with were all based on the kaiju they saw on TV as kids. With an index number of 1, this Godzilla-inspired design might have been the very first Pokémon sprite they ever made. Game Freak named it Gyaun, the Japanese word for Godzilla's roar. So, Nob gave it the English name Gawarhead, retaining that original roar reference while also alluding to a warhead, the weapon humans frequently use to try and kill Godzilla. Along with Gawarhead, these next 5 lost Pokémon were all revealed in a biographical manga telling the life story of Satoshi Tajiri. Released in Japan in 2018, the manga included some real-life design documents from Red and Green's development, like the shark Pokémon with a harpoon on its snout that Nob calls Sharpoon. Most official Pokémon names, like Blastoise and Arcanine, are portmanteaus, the combination of 2 or more words mashed together, and many of Nob's names follow that precedent. This Pokémon's name was just Cactus, so Nob named it Cactormus, a portmanteau of cactus and torment, and this one in Japanese was simply named Deer, though it appears to be more of a moose, so Nob named it Ramoose, a portmanteau of ram and moose. This creepy crocodile he calls Goblin, which is Gavile, a type of fish-eating crocodile, combined with the word villain. A back sprite that leaked in 2019 shows us a slightly different Goblin with spikes in place of hair. So, it appears the wacky hair version was made first, then Goblin's hair was later replaced with spikes before ultimately getting scrapped altogether. This balloon Pokémon was likely cut in favor of Jigglypuff, whose Pokédex classification is the balloon Pokémon. This lost Pokémon's Japanese name was Balanda. So, just like many Pokémon whose names aren't portmanteaus, Nob simply anglicized the original name to make its English name Balumba. Another kaiju Pokémon seems to be inspired by Mechagodzilla. Its beta sprite was officially revealed by Pokémon Company CEO Tsunekazu Ishihara on a Japanese TV show in late 2018. Its Japanese name was Omega, so Nob calls it Omegaj to incorporate the word gadget. First appearing on Game Freak's website in 1997, 2 of the earliest lost Pokémon ever made public were scrapped Weedle evolutions. The middle stage is a pupa, so Nob named it Pupal, combining the word pupa with pal, as in a friend, and the final stage appears to be some sort of beetle. According to its designer, Atsuko Nishida, it ended up being replaced with Beedrill because the original just wasn't cool enough. Nob calls this scrapped final form Carapthor, derived from carapace, the exoskeleton covering a bug's thorax. We asked him where the suffix Thor in Carapthor came from, and Nob said nowhere in particular. He just thought it sounded cool. Many official Pokémon names are portmanteaus and anglicizations, but lots of them, just like Carapthor, were chosen for no other reason than sounding cool. This flying fish Pokémon was found in leaked files from early in Gen 2's development, and it was the only beta sprite in that particular leak that came with with a name attached, Sato, which may have translated to fishbird. Nob gave it the self-explanatory name Sailwing. In 2018, Gold and Silver's 1997 demo leaked online, revealing dozens of lost Pokémon the fanbase had never seen before. Instead of Cyndaquil, the original fire starter was Hanuguma, which roughly translates to bear. Nob calls it Cubburn, another portmanteau, this time for cub, like a baby bear cub, and burn. Thanks to a series of leaked sprites, we can see that Cubburn was gradually revised into Teddiursa over the next 2 years of Gold and Silver's development. Cubburn evolves into Flambert, a combination of flame and bear, which together also sounds like flambe, a cooking method involving setting your food on fire. The family's final stage is Bruinous, a reference to Bruin, a folk word for bears, as well as ruinous. The original water starter was based on a plesiosaur, a type of marine reptile that first came into existence about 200 million years ago and went extinct the same time that the dinosaurs did. Nob calls it Palsio, derived from plesiosaur as well as the word pal. Its first evolution is Presio, and its final form is Donmarine, referencing a head honcho like a Mafia Don, as well as submarines. Some fans believe they were scrapped in development for looking too much like Lapras, who's also based on a plesiosaur, but since Game Freak never officially addressed this leak, we can only speculate. The 1997 demo also introduced baby and fully evolved forms of Tangela, which Nob dubbed Burgula and Jungula. Burgula uses Tangela's Gela suffix, and the prefix Berg derives from Bur, a type of seed, as well as the word burgeoning, which means to grow or flourish quickly. And Jungula is derived from jungle. Quillfish also had a scrapped evolution, Kozapalin. The Kozap part comes from the lightning bolt on its forehead, and the overall name references its visual similarity to zeppelins. Interestingly, another Gen 2 leak contained what appears to be an even earlier beta sprite for Kozapalin, with a more simple blowfish design. This 3-stage family consists of a sunfish, a shark, and a gulper eel, with each stage representing a real-life animal that lives progressively deeper in the ocean. The first stage, Molambino, takes its name from the sunfish Mola Mola, as well as Bambino, the Italian word for a baby or child. The shark's Japanese name was Ikari, which translates to both anchor and rage. Its discovery in the demo led some fans to speculate that it was the original namesake for the Lake of Rage, which in Japanese is called Ikari no Mizu Umi. And if that's the case, the lake probably would have been full of Ikari, the anchor-tailed shark Pokemon. Nob calls it Angor, a mix between anchor, anger, and gore, like a gory shark attack. And its final evolution he calls Lureel, a portmanteau of lure, surreal, and eel. Girafarig also had a pre-evolution appearing to be a pair of conjoined twin ghosts. Nob calls them Bipola, derived from the words bipolar and polar, since they're pulling in 2 different directions. A leak from later in development actually shows a more refined design where they're still twin ghosts, but no longer attached. The leaked file was dated June 1999, just 5 months before Gold and Silver released in Japan, so it seems Bipola almost made the cut. Bipola's design makes a little more sense when you realize that, in the demo, Girafarig originally had 2 equally sized giraffe heads, which was pretty clever since both the English and Japanese names are spelled the same backwards and forwards, just like the design itself. The demo also contained a Ditto evolution Nob calls Mimeo, named after mimeographs, machines that duplicate text, as well as the word mimic. It also ends with the O sound to match Ditto's name style. Just like its pre-evolution, Mimeo could only learn one move, transform, so its redundancy was probably why it didn't make Gen 2's final cut. It would have evolved from Ditto when it was traded holding a metal coat, so some fans have speculated that Mimeo influenced the design of Melton 2 decades later. These 2 Pokemon's true forms are kept intentionally mysterious, since they hide their real selves underneath the skin of a wolf. This may be why they ended up getting cut, as the existence of wolf pelts can raise some dark questions about the Pokemon world. Nob calls the first stage Warfurs, a combination of war and furs, and its evolution is Werelican, a mashup of were and lycanthropy, which is a word to describe werewolf transformations. Both names are also a play on Bofors and Orlikon flak cannons, 2 brands remains of flak cannon common in World War II. Warfurs and Werelican were originally brown in Gold and Silver's 1997 demo, but Game Freak changed their colors to blue later on in production, presumably to reflect their ice typing. This Pokémon appears to be the creature latched onto Slowbro's tail, although its data in the demo doesn't indicate it was actually related to the Slowbro family, which could mean it was entirely independent, or Game Freak simply hadn't gotten around to programming the data just yet. Its Japanese name was Taban, suggesting it's the turban that Slowking wears on its head. So, Nob gave it the English name Disturbin, a portmanteau of turban and disturb, as its very existence is somewhat disturbing, just like real turban snails. A family of dark-type felines had a bell theme and were only capable of being female, so Nob named the first stage Moibel, a combination of Mademoiselle and Belle, and its evolution he calls Beldaum, a mashup of Belle, Dame, and Bedlam. Their signature move was Heal Bell, which can also be learned by the Skitty family, a moon-themed cat family introduced in Gen 3, who some fans suggest are sort of spiritual successors to the Moibel family. If it hadn't been cut, this bomb-carrying seal would have been the series' first dual-type water and fire Pokémon. Nob calls it Grenmar, short for grenade, marine, and mar, an old-fashioned word that means to inflict serious bodily harm or to destroy. This one Nob called Belignan, derived from bell, belligerent, and malignant. It would have been a branch evolution for Weepinbell when it touches a poison stone. In the final game, Sprout Tower's only 3 stories tall, but the internal data reveals lots of unused floors that would have made it 9 stories tall. This might explain why an NPC in the final game still says the tower's central pillar is a 100-foot tall dead Bellsprout. Some fans speculate that Belignan and the Poison Stone were originally meant to play a prominent role in this much larger version of Sprout Tower. In the game's final build, however, Belignan and the Poison Stone got cut entirely, and the tower got shrunk down to just a third of its original size. There was actually an alternate Belignan design discovered in a leak from much later in development, so it seems it was one of the last Pokémon to get removed from the game. These electric tigers are what Nob calls Tyker and Strigar. Tyker is a portmanteau of tiger and tyke, a word for a small child. This was a name suggested to Nob by our artist Rachel Briggs years ago, and when we saw that he chose it for the video, we asked him not to use a fan name, but he said if a name was good, he actually would have been fine using a fan name back in the 90s. Strigar is a combination of strike, tiger, and taiga, the winter forest biome where you can find Siberian tigers. One leak revealed Tyker and Strigar were created during Red and Green's development, which means they actually got cut from 2 generations back to back. They even had an additional evolution in Gen 1, but only its back sprite was found in the leak, so we can only speculate about its frontal appearance. The leak also didn't include a name for the final stage, which means it won't be getting a name from Nob. 2 decades before Farfetch'd got an evolution in Generation 8, Game Freak almost gave us one in Gen 2. Nob calls it Luxswan, a combination of the words luxury and swan. It first appeared in Gold and Silver's 1997 demo and later got an updated sprite with a new color scheme. But ultimately, Luxswan didn't make the final cut. Perhaps the creepiest Pokémon in the demo were these 2 ghosts based on Asian culture. The first stage is based on a bear and Waraningyo, which is a straw doll that originated in Chinese rituals. They're also used in Japan, where they're nailed against trees to curse people, similar to how voodoo dolls work. It appears the attack Curse was created as its signature attack. Even though the straw doll Pokémon ended up getting cut, Curse still made it into the final game. Nob calls this one Stroman, derived from straw man and omen, like how bad omens foreshadow tragic events. Its evolution is both a panda and a Jiangshi, also known as a Chinese hopping vampire. Though their depictions vary from story to story, Jiangshi often wear traditional Chinese clothes and hop around with their arms outstretched, searching for victims to kill and absorb their qi. You can kill a Jiangshi by writing a spell on thin yellow paper and sticking it to their foreheads. Nob calls it Fandarin, a mashup of phantom, panda, and mandarin, as in Mandarin Chinese. Stroman and Fandarin were cut pretty early on in Gen 2's development, probably due to their occult origins and being a little too creepy for the Pokémon brand. Scyther got a new evolution in Gen 2 in the form of Scizor, and Pinsir was originally planned to receive one as well, which Nob calls Tricules, due to its 3 horns and the fact that it's based on a Hercules beetle. These colors were changed from brown to pink later later on, before ultimately getting cut just a few months before Gold and Silver's release, possibly to make room for Heracross, who's also based on a Hercules beetle. The demo had a total of 17 baby Pokémon, but apparently Game Freak decided that was too many, so they ended up cutting it down to just 7 in the final game. One of these lost babies was a 3-tailed Vulpix pre-evolution, Nob names Volpe, with the 3 eyes referencing the Roman numeral for 3. Nob actually would have preferred to theme the whole family in this style, telling us, "I wish I could go back in time and convince them. It could have been Volpv, and make 9 tails Vulpix, with Roman numerals representing the number of tails." Volpv was actually created and then cut during Gen 1, and later got cut again during Gen 2's development, just like these next 3 babies, who also all got cut from both gens as well. Starting with Coinpurr, a Meowth pre-evolution who gets its name from coin purse and purr. Coinpurr's sprite has 3 different coins above its head, but they're not present in its back sprite. This has led some fans to believe that they weren't actually a part of its design, but were placed there by designers as options, so they could later pick which coin shape would appear on its forehead. Baby Ponyta was Colta, derived from col and colt, the word for a young male horse. It also ends with ta to match Ponyta. And Orfry was baby Goldeen, whose name comes from Or, which means gold, because the Goldeen family are all goldfish, as well as Fry, the word for a fish that has just hatched. The rest of these scrapped babies were only cut from Gen 2, and as far as we can tell from all the leaks, were never intended for Gen 1. Baby Doduo is Dotery, beginning with DOD to match its evolutions, followed by Airy, which means bird's nest, and in Old English refers to a family of birds. Even though its 3 heads make for an interesting bird's nest motif, the fact that its evolutionary line would have gone from 3 heads to 2 heads to 3 again may raise some uncomfortable questions about where that 3rd head goes as Doduo, which might have been why it got cut. Paraspore gets its name from its evolution, Paris, and also the word spore. Paris and Parasect show a parasitic mushroom increasingly taking control over its host insect, but paradoxically, Paraspore appears to be growing out of its mushroom. This runs counter to the evolutionary narrative of its evolutions, and similar to Dotery, the fact that it doesn't quite make sense might explain why it didn't make the cut. Baby Grimer is called Smudge, whose name and design are both pretty self-explanatory. Smudge was originally pink, but in a later build had its color changed to gray, possibly to make it look less like Ditto before the developers decided to remove Smudge from the game altogether. There's also a Growlithe pre-evolution, Puparon, derived from the word pup, and also pepperoni, because it's a hot and spicy fire type. Another leak from earlier in Gen 2's production contained what appeared to be an even older design for Puparon. Unfortunately, that particular leak didn't include names or evolution data, so it's impossible to be 100% certain that it is in fact an early Puparon. And there's only one Lost Unova Pokemon discovered so far that has a name, a dual-type grass and ground Pokemon labeled Nekoyagi, which is Japanese for root goat. It was shown for only a few seconds in a slideshow at Tokyo's Meiji University in 2010. With the help of Helix Chamber member Luminosis, we enhanced and translated that slide to get a better understanding of its concept, which may have eventually evolved into Gen 5's Sawsbuck, or Gen 6's Go-Goat, or possibly both. Nob calls it Tuba Capra, named after root vegetable tubers, and also Capra, the scientific word for goats. And just as importantly, it rhymes with Chupacabra, the mythical blood-sucking goat monster that was supposedly first spotted in Puerto Rico in 1995. The last Pokemon on our list is none other than Gorochu, the Raichu evolution cut from Gen 1. According to Game Freak's Koji Nishino, the developers had no choice but to remove several Pokemon from the game, as they'd run out of cartridge space. As a result, some 3-stage families got cut to just 2 stages. Not only Gorochu, but also some of the babies like Volpe and Coinpurr. No concept art or front sprite were ever leaked or officially revealed by Game Freak. This artwork is based on its back sprite and a description by its creator, Atsuko Nishida, who told Japanese newspaper Yomiuri that it had fangs and horns and looked like a god of thunder. Since Pikachu and Raichu kept their original Japanese names in virtually every language around the world, it seems fitting to leave this one unchanged as well, and refer to it simply as Gorochu.
This is Japanese scriptwriter and novelist Takeshi Shudo. Shudo was the head writer for the first 5 years of the Pokémon anime, as well as the first 3 Pokémon movies. His creative process was fueled by alcohol and tranquilizers, and in the last 2 years before his death, he became obsessed with the only Pokémon he ever created, Lugia. In retrospect, it almost seems inevitable that Lugia would appear in Pokémon 2nd Generation, especially since Lugia's place as Silver's box legendary is nothing short of iconic. But Lugia's inclusion in Gen 2 wasn't originally part of the plan. Gold and Silver's development began as soon as Red and Green were finished, with Game Freak originally saying Gen 2 would release in 1997, but their release date ended up getting delayed by a full 2 years, and according to Shudo, if it wasn't for that massive delay, Lugia's inclusion in Gold and Silver would have been impossible, which raises an interesting question. If that 2-year delay never happened, which Pokémon was originally planned as Silver's mascot? More leaks have since revealed an even earlier proto-Pokédex, in which Ho-Oh, Unknown, and a third Pokémon were all grouped together. This lost Pokémon ultimately got scrapped, but it appears to have been based on Shushu from Chinese mythology, also known as lion dogs. In China, they're considered guardians, and Shushu statues are often placed at the entrances of imperial palaces, temples, government offices, and the homes of the wealthy. Ho-Oh is clearly based on the Chinese phoenix Feng Huang, which suggests this pair of Chinese-inspired legendary beasts may have been the 2 Pokémon Game Freak originally planned for Gold and Silver's box art. The developers themselves never commented on the leak, however, so that's all just a theory, and you'd do well to take it with a grain of salt. Even before Shudo came up with the movie's plot, the first ideas he came up with were 2 main characters, the Collector and what he called Pokémon X, a placeholder name for what eventually became Lugia. According to Shudo, X was supposed to be a creature different from Pokémon, since it had to symbolize life for humans too. It's a symbol of life, but also a symbol of coexistence. Originally, Pokémon didn't have genders, but X symbolizes deep ocean currents and created life on Earth. It's a maternal Pokémon. He created Lugia as the maternal symbol of life and deep ocean currents, but like many Pokémon, after coming up with the creature's concept, the details were out of the creator's control. Not just Lugia's name, but also its voice and gender. He felt strongly that as a maternal god, Lugia should have been voiced by a female actress, but the film studio went against his wishes and chose a male actor instead. The first Lugia beta sprite ever found is dated back to a month before the second movie landed in Japanese theaters. It looks nearly identical to Lugia's final design, but has 6 dorsal spines instead of the 10 on the finished sprite. But there's an even older beta sprite dating back to the Shushu period that may have been an even earlier form of Lugia, an unnamed boat Pokemon, now known only by its proto-Pokédex number 344. Just like Lugia, 344 appears to draw partial inspiration from plesiosaurs, a type of marine reptile that went extinct 65 million years ago. Some of its physical details are similar as well, especially its dorsal design, long neck, and its tail, which has led some fans to speculate that after Shudo came up with the Pokémon X concept, Game Freak might have used 344 as a springboard to come up with a brand new design that ultimately became Lugia. As an apparent non-legendary, some fans also believe 344 may have been evolutionary related to 2 other lost Pokémon from that version of the Proto-Dex. However, any relation between Lugia and 344 is entirely speculative. There's also the question of Lugia's elemental type, a topic that's caused some confusion ever since its inception. Neither the film or Shudo himself ever directly addressed Lugia's type, although presumably when Shudo created the God of the Sea, he probably intended her as half water type. But when Game Freak went to program it into Gold and Silver, they ended up making it dual type Psychic and Flying. According to programmer and designer Shigeki Morimoto, Lugia was made half Psychic simply because they wanted to make it strong. In the July 2009 issue of Nintendo Dream magazine, he said, "We wanted Lugia to give the impression of being a powerful Pokemon, so we settled on Psychic for the second type, instead of Water type." In other words, Lugia's not a Water type, despite being underwater, because due to its flying type appearance and Psychic type being the symbol of a powerful Pokemon at the time.
If you want even more cut content trivia, check out our last video all about cut content from the Zelda series. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.